this lecture, we're going to be considering the Daoists. And so the first order of business is to address who the Daoists actually were. I've so far said a little bit about the Daoists as being thinkers who tend to focus on the way that everything in the world is interconnected, that there's a kind of fundamental flux in which energies flow, and we're all part of that. But as far as specifying what the Daoists believed, there are a few problems. One problem is that sometimes the word was used mainly to distinguish some people from Confucians. This was particularly true when Confucians held power in the government. There were the orthodox people, the Confucians, and then there were the others, the Daoists. It would be a little bit like thinking of all the unorthodox people you know. Well, they may have some things in common, but what they mostly have in common is what they're not. There's also a tendency to distinguish two different kinds of Taoism. I think a tendency that's overemphasized. This tendency is to talk about religious Taoists as opposed to philosophical Taoists. To say a little bit more about that distinction, I should mention one of the earliest figures who is linked to the Taoist school of thought, a person named Yang Chu. Yang Chu is known in Chinese thought as an egoist, which is fairly rare, actually. I was mentioning in a previous lecture that the Chinese tend to focus on the relations that everyone has to other people in particular, but also nature as well. So the fact that Yang Chu is rather egoistic is rather striking. Particularly, Yang Chu argues that there's nothing more valuable than life itself. So he doesn't think it's worthwhile to expend your energy doing things that actually risk your life. The Confucians in particular thought this was really abhorrent. If there aren't things that you would risk your life for or put yourself out for, in their opinion, you're really falling down on your ethical responsibilities. But Yang Chu's emphasis was on maintaining your health, maintaining your vitality. And this does tend to be a kind of continuing theme in Taoism, even though very few people would go as far as Yang Chu in pushing it. So the difference that's sometimes made between philosophical and religious Taoists has to do with in what sense you are protecting your life or protecting your vitality. There was a long emphasis in China on various ways to extend your life in a very practical sense. Certainly emperors sometimes were specialists in hiring people to help them learn how to live longer. Perhaps some of these potions and things that were taken actually had just the opposite effect of their intention. But the idea was if you could figure out some ways of using things in nature to help you continue your life and make it thrive, to maintain your vitality, so much the better. On the other hand, because death does seem to be a part of life, some of the more philosophical Taoists tend to reflect on the fact that we're all part of this continuing flux that is everything. So what's really important or fundamental about us continues with the flow of nature. And on the surface, those seem to be somewhat opposite goals, trying to live as long as you possibly can as an individual versus viewing yourself as part of the whole, and therefore your individual life and death isn't it's so extremely important. In fact, I think a lot of people tended to see both of those as reasonable goals. Not too many people were in any position to go as far as Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, for example, who actually sent an expedition out to look for the Western paradise. Paradise was viewed as somehow in the West, and so he thought, well, if I just send a delegation, maybe this will improve my relationship or my chances for paradise. But at the same time, he was trying to extend his life as long as he possibly could. On the other hand, a lot of people may have thought, well, to extend your life, but being human beings, being mortal, of course we are part of the flow. So this is something to take solace in after we die or when people near us die. There are two texts that I'm going to be referring to in this lecture. And these two texts are really important texts in Taoism. But some of the tensions that occur between, for example, the goal of trying to live individually as long as you can versus seeing yourself as part of the whole, or trying to protect your health as much as you can versus allowing yourself to go with the flow of nature, these appear in both within each of these texts and sometimes between them. The first of these is fairly well known, at least by its title in the West. This is the Tao Te Ching. It's also referred to as the Lao Tzu because it's attributed to a sage called Lao Tzu who lived in the 6th century BCE. There is an individual named Lao Tzu that historians have associated this text with, though there may be some question as to whether or not Lao Tzu actually wrote most of it. But another thing that's particularly pleasing, I think, to the Daoists in particular, is the fact that Lao Tzu in translation means old master. So in a sense, these are very sagely teachings that come to us from antiquity. The second of these texts is a work called the Zhuangzi, after the person who wrote it. Zhuangzi is a great writer. And one of the things that's remarkable about this text is how stories, particularly humorous stories, are used to make philosophical points. In general, and it's very hard to summarize this book, one of the things that does seem to be a consistent theme is the stories are always trying to defy our expectations. So if you expect someone in a position of authority to be able to speak with authority, maybe that's going to be just the opposite of what happens here. Sometimes people that are characterized as complete losers end up speaking great wisdom. At one point, the fact that someone who has had quite a lot to drink rolls out of a cart and doesn't injure himself because he's so supple is praised. Things like that that just normally don't seem to be the kind of image of how you'd want people to live or role models for everyone to emulate. These tend to be what Zhuangzi excels in. Now, part of the point of this is that the Daoists in general, as a school, insofar as you can call it a school, were critical of Confucianism, and particularly the emphasis on certain kinds of rituals or playing certain well-established or scripted parts. Their idea was that there's too much emphasis in Confucianism on traditional ways of doing things and too little on one's inner nature. Now, as I mentioned when I talked about Confucius, Confucius would certainly deny that what he was trying to do is encourage people to go through the motions of playing out a role, taking certain vows, carrying out a ceremony without the feeling behind it. But the Daoists think that there's always going to be a discrepancy between something that is already pre-given as a role or a script and your inner feeling. They think the best way to interact with other human beings is not through social vocabulary of rituals that have been well established over time. Instead, they think what we should do is allow our inner nature to express itself as directly as possible and choose its own means for doing that. So in general, what they would view as Confucian overemphasis on ritual, they would say is just really the trappings of socialization. We're socialized to do certain kinds of things. We do these habitually, but these are really not the best way for human beings to really come together as minds and hearts. For this reason, they tend to place a lot less emphasis than the Confucians do on political office. The Confucians, as I mentioned, certainly think that you can play an important role in government whether you're in political office or not. But nevertheless, the emphasis is often on social harmony and having the right person in the right place within the government and so on. The Daoists tend to think that a lot of effort is placed on trying to get into the right position, and people spend their lives in one position trying to get into another position. So much energy, so much effort, so much frustration goes into these efforts. All this vitality is being wasted. So again, the idea of conserving your vitality, allowing your vitality to work spontaneously and not with these kind of long-term projects of improving your office, getting more influence, and so on. This tends to be a very dominant influence among the Daoists, a dominant theme with the Daoists. In general, the Daoists tend to think that much of life, for most people, is spent trying too hard to do things that seem a little bit foreign to their nature. I think of situations where people are first dating and the kind of effort people make to be attractive to members of the opposite sex. And the sort of feeling one has if you notice children, I would call them children, teenagers dating when they're trying so hard to impress each other, and they'd probably like each other so much better if they just stopped trying. The Taoists think that our lives are filled with that exact problem, that we're always trying to figure out what people want ahead of time and trying to bend ourselves into that particular mold, when in fact, if we just allowed our real nature to come through, things would be much better. The goal, positively, is to attune ourselves and our activities with our own nature. Now, our nature as particulars is continuous with the nature of the Tao as a whole. So in talking about our nature, there's one sense in which we can talk about our individual nature coming through, as when we talk about someone's personality. Use your real personality, don't try to pretend that you're somebody else. On the other hand, there's also a sense that the flow of nature as a whole is operating through us. And many of the passages in really both of the texts that I mentioned have to do with the way of allowing nature to flow through you. As a consequence, one of the emphases in both of these texts is on what might look like relative passivity, not asserting yourself, allowing yourself to be flexible, allowing the forces of your situation to work through you. Now, for some Taoists, this tended to be such an extreme goal that they set as a goal for themselves the idea of being a recluse, just living out in nature, allowing life to kind of move as it did. Obviously, someone would need to be providing food, and it's not really very clear how Taoists who wanted to be recluses intended to do that in all cases. But the idea is that basically you don't assert, you kind of retire from the world, live in nature, become one with nature, and that's really the best way to conserve your vitality and live a good life. Others, however, often feeling that it was absolutely necessary to be involved in society, view Taoism as really a kind of recipe for how to be most effective. It's not necessary in order to be a Taoist to think that you absolutely have to give up all goals in any sense. After all, many people who think that Taoism makes a lot of sense do have goals. They have jobs, at the very least, and certain obligations that they need to fulfill. But the idea here is that you fulfill these things best when you really allow the forces of nature to work with you. And the problem is that too often what we do is get caught up in certain ideas about what success is, what we want to happen, and work so hard bending a situation to fit our preconceptions that we choose unobvious ways of doing things instead of allowing things to more naturally take a shape that's really much more stable. Another theme within Taoism is a skepticism of language. Now, this may sound like a pretty familiar theme by now. We've mentioned a number of philosophers who've pointed out that language is limited. Though it's a tool of ours, sometimes it interferes with us. What the Taoists think that language does is interfere with our perception. And so one way of focusing on what the positive aspiration of a Taoist is to be perceptive, to really take in what the situation is. If you think about a situation where someone that you've sort of got sized up is going to say something, and think about how you listen if you've already decided, well, this person is a conservative. This person is a liberal. This person is a Marxist. This person is a reactionary. The way you listen in each of those cases, just because of your label on that person, is going to be very different. And the Taoists think we do this in all kinds of ways. We've already decided what we expect to hear, and that's what we do hear. We know what we already expect to see, and that's what we actually see. We almost don't notice things that interfere with the sort of grid that we've already established by means of our concepts and our language. So interestingly, the opening line of the Tao Te Ching is the following: "The way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name." The suggestion here, among many, and I think there are lots of ways that this can be taken, one of the suggestions is that anything that we have a kind of category for even though that might reflect something about a situation when we have the perception that leads us to form this category, if we hang on to the category, we're going to miss the phenomena. So if we decide, this is going to be an illustration of what the conservative viewpoint is, then we're going to be paying attention only to those things that reinforce our own ideas. Our perception is not going to take in much of anything that is either dissonant or not actually positively supporting the idea we already have in the first place. Zhuangzi also reflects this idea when he compares our language to a fishing net. And he points out that what's really important in the case of using a fishing net is that you're looking for fish, not the fact that the net is as it is. His comment: the fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've gotten the fish, you can forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've gotten the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten the meaning, you can forget the words. So he's suggesting that basically we have these various ways of freezing our insights, and these are useful to us. I mean, obviously language is a tool, and he himself is writing, so he's not adverse to using it in any kind of context. But nevertheless, there's a danger if we don't somehow take as the prior concern what's actually going on around us. Language is helpful to help us remember certain patterns that we've observed, but too much of the time we pay so much attention to generalizations we've already formulated in language that we stop paying attention to the world, and that's what's dangerous. What we really need to do is be more attentive to the world itself, which in this case is going to be understood as the Tao. The kind of knowledge that would be recommended from a Taoist point of view is therefore not going to be primarily verbal or conceptual. One can describe the kind of knowledge that's encouraged as really knowing how rather than knowing that. Zhuangzi uses lots of examples of craftspeople and artists as people that have a tremendous kind of knowledge, but it's not knowledge that you can definitely articulate in words. It would probably be easier to teach a lot of crafts or arts if it were easy to put these things into words. I think, for example, of cases where people are learning to play an instrument for the first time. Well, of course, there are things that the teacher can tell the student. For example, learning to play the piano. Well, how to hold your hand. No, you're doing it a little bit, you're holding your hands a little bit too high, or your hands aren't really high enough. Those sorts of things you can use language a little bit to gesture toward, but even then, it's always kind of pushing in a certain direction. It's not absolutely pinpointing what it is that needs to happen. And there's a lot of assimilation of the whole art that comes about when one is doing this as well. Another example is driving. I remember when I first started driving thinking, how am I ever going to keep track of all of these cars around me? And my dad, who was driving with me, said, don't worry about them. Now, of course, he didn't mean don't pay attention to the rest of traffic, but what he meant was I don't have to be in charge of how all of those are moving. That's something that I can take in a way as a side concern, but my focus needed to be what I was doing. And in a sense, that's what the Taoists are recommending too. Instead of kind of scattered looking at all kinds of things that might be a problem, paying attention to what you're doing, knowing how to do something is a whole art rather than just knowing some facts of the matter, knowing where the cars are relative to each other, knowing how fast they're moving. If I spent my time when I was driving calculating all that, I'd be a real menace on the road. And that's exactly what the Taoists think often happens in our everyday life, because we spend a lot of time focusing on this or that observation that we've already made. We kind of lose track of what we're doing. And the artist, the craftsperson, is someone who really knows how to focus on what they're doing and use what they've learned over time to produce a certain kind of art. Because a relative passivity is encouraged in Taoism, some of the recommendations that the Taoists suggest are negatively expressed. again, we have this notion of via negativa, if you will, the idea of saying something in a negative way in order to gesture towards something that's much more positive. Probably the most general term of this sort that comes up in Daoist writings is wu wei, which is sometimes translated non-action, although non-assertive action is probably a better translation. The idea here is, instead of acting with an agenda from the beginning, best to not assert yourself, not impose your ordering on the world, but act in response to the world. The Lao Tzu has a set of formulas that suggest what this involves. Do that which consists in taking no action. Pursue that which is not meddlesome. Savor that which has no flavor. Lay plans for the accomplishment of the difficult before it becomes difficult. Make something big by starting with it when small. It is because a sage never attempts to be great that he succeeds in becoming great. There's certainly many paradoxes in that particular passage. And this, too, I think, points to this idea of the via negativa, trying to figure out, well, what could possibly be meant by saying, because the sage isn't trying to be great, the sage becomes great. Well, what the sage does do is avoid asserting an agenda, really aiming at something that's going to require forcing everything else in your environment to fall into place. Really pushing your agenda is almost always a way not to get the world to cooperate with you. You might think of this interpersonally. Sometimes if you have an idea that you express too strongly, it makes others, in a sense, kind of shy away from it, and maybe they would have been perfectly willing to go along with it if you hadn't come on so strong. I met a man once who had been legally dead for 14 minutes, and he said that it hadn't in some ways changed his life as much as one might expect, but the big change was that after this experience, he didn't feel like forcing the issue so much anymore. He's a businessman, and he mentioned the fact that although he still made deals, he waited for things to fall into place more and then closed the deal when it seemed that the time was right to do it, instead of doing all kinds of things to manipulate things to kind of force the issue when he wanted it to happen. This would be the Daoist conception here. Don't have an agenda that you're going to force on experience. Be constantly attuning yourself to experience. I think dancing might be another metaphor that can help us to see what's involved here. If you learn to dance, say in a dance class, and then attempt to dance with a partner in some context, it may be that what you're going to be thinking about first of all is, now, which foot do I start with? What is the basic move? And so on. In a sense, that's dancing. But as long as you're thinking about that, it's not really dancing in the sense of being graceful. And the Taoist conception of the best way to live is to be graceful with the flow of all events. So it's not as though you're passive in the sense of tuning everything out. Quite the contrary. You're attentively perceiving everything and responding subtly at every moment. So to say it's non-action is not really the best translation, but to say non-assertive action, I think, is a good way of understanding Wu Wei. We're acting, but we're acting in response and in accordance with everything that's around us. The Tao Te Ching sometimes talks about this in terms of a mystical union with the rhythms of the world. One of the intriguing things about the Tao Te Ching is that it's been viewed as a manual for all kinds of different purposes. Some people see it as a manual that mainly has to do with mystical experience. It's been used as a medical manual, with its emphasis on sustaining life, etc. And interestingly enough, even though those sound like very unworldly kinds of activities, it's also been seen as a very pointed set of advisories to people who actually are political leaders. Again, a theme that we've noticed before. In the case of Shunzi, the idea in Taoism is that for someone to really be a good leader involves exactly this policy of Wu Wei. A good ruler doesn't have to force the issue constantly. I mean, that does nothing but get a lot of people to be antagonistic toward the ruler's goal. The best ruler is someone who doesn't have to do anything that's very aggressive, but instead assesses a situation and allows things to move with only very subtle intervention, if that. In the Tao Te Ching, we see the following passage. The best of all rulers is but a shadowy presence to his subjects. When his task is accomplished and his work done, the people all say, it happened to us naturally. That's a kind of extreme political goal that I don't think too many of the contemporary spin doctors would be too happy about it. Political spin doctor generally thinks that people in politics should take credit where credit is due, maybe even where it isn't. But certainly you want credit. This vision is that, no, if you're looking for credit, you're not really dealing with the situation of being a ruler in the best way. The best ruler is one that allows things to move as they will, intervening only very reluctantly when it's absolutely necessary. But an intelligent ruler is one who has arranged things in such a way and is responsive to the needs of the people, so much so that nobody's even aware that any policies have been put into place. So if people think, oh yeah, this just kind of naturally happened, and don't give credit to the ruler, this could be an indication that the ruler was actually doing the best of possible jobs. The notion of Wu Wei also includes the notion of being objective. Now, this is not objectivity in the Western sense of trying to figure out what reality is independent of any point of view. Of course, we always have a point of view, and the Taoists in particular would be emphasizing that fact. If we're talking about vitality as it flows through us, we're certainly talking from a point of view. But objectivity here, again, has to do with attuning oneself to the world, recognizing what the situation of the world is, and then responding to that. So instead of trying to coming into any situation with your own ideas of how things ought to be, allowing things to take the shape that they do. When I first heard the expression go with the flow, I thought of this in a very mystical kind of sense, until I got to LA and tried to drive on the freeways there. And then I thought, it's no surprise that this got to be so popular in California. You have to go with the flow if you're going to go at all. And I think that the kind of state of mind that leads to road rage is exactly the kind of thing that the Taoists point out is always brewing as long as we're insistent on forcing our agenda on our situation. Certainly, if you're stuck in LA traffic, not moving very fast, it's possible to be very frustrated by that. I can get frustrated by that with much less traffic, just if I hit a few red lights, one red light too many, and I think, oh no, I'm not going to be able to do this errand I was planning on doing. The Taoists would say, forget the errand. The errand maybe isn't that important. It's more important to respond to exactly what's going on. And having an agenda is a sure way of making one feel out of sorts with one's environment. But what's really essential is to become attuned to one's environment. Even Chinese military thought emphasizes this idea of using the environment to enhance one's own abilities rather than trying to force your will on the environment. So for instance, locating oneself, fortifying your position on top of a hill, say, is a good thing to do because the environment will do some of the work for you. If people are going to charge the hill, that's going to take a lot of work, and it might very well expose them. You can use gravity to a certain extent. Roll down logs, I mean, a kind of old-fashioned traditional military technique. These sorts of things indicate that the environment can move with you as long as you're responsive to it. But what won't work is you're imposing your will on the environment. We'll have more to say about this in the next lecture.